5 signs God warns you to stay silent. The sacred power hidden in silence. Opening the holy stillness before words. When the world grows louder than ever, when everyone fights to speak, to prove to be heard, there are moments when God gently whispers, "Be silent." It's not the silence of fear, but the silence of power, a sacred stillness that only those who have walked through storms of the soul can truly understand. There are words that need not be spoken, yet still echo deeply. There are silences that speak louder than 1,000 cries. In the pause between breaths, when every noise inside the mind fades away, the soul begins to hear what the world cannot, the tender voice of God. We often believe that to be understood, we must speak; to be defended, we must explain; to be loved, we must prove ourselves. But God has another way. He teaches us that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in speaking, but in stopping, in being still, and in trusting Him. In that very silence, He works. In that quiet surrender, He opens the way. And when our lips stay closed, heaven begins to move. Silence before God is not an escape from reality. It is an entrance into a deeper one, where the soul and the Creator meet without words, where tears become prayers, and every heartbeat becomes worship. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10 is not merely a command, but a divine invitation to step away from the noise of self and step into the peace of His presence. There are times when we speak the truth, but at the wrong time. Times when our words are right, but our motives are wrong. And there are also moments when silence itself becomes the truest expression of the heart. When the soul is wounded, words can easily turn into weapons. When the heart is angry, speech becomes fire. But when we stop, when we let God touch the wound, silence turns into a healing balm for the spirit. Sometimes God warns us through that quiet tug in our hearts, a holy hesitation that tells us, if we speak now, we might destroy what He is building. There are conversations where God says, "Be still," because He's working behind the scenes. There are arguments where He doesn't want us to win with words, but with faith. And sometimes, silence becomes our greatest testimony of trust, when we no longer need to defend ourselves, because we know God is already defending us. Silence can hurt, because it forces us to face ourselves, to confront the thoughts we've buried, the fears we've denied. Yet within that stillness lies the deepest kind of healing. In the noise of the world, silence becomes a refuge for the weary soul, a place where God whispers, "I am here." And when we truly learn to be silent before Him, everything around us begins to change. Anger melts into peace, pain transforms into wisdom, and fear gives way to strength. 5 signs God warns you to stay silent. The sacred power hidden in silence is more than a message. It's a spiritual journey that every heart must walk. For each of us has spoken when we should have stayed silent, and stayed silent when we should have spoken. Yet, through every misstep, God remains patient, teaching us how to listen, how to wait, and how to let silence become the most beautiful form of prayer. Silence does not kill words. It sanctifies them. It transforms every word that follows into something deeper, humbler, and more filled with grace. So when you feel that strong urge to speak, pause and ask, "Is this my voice, or God's voice within me?" If the answer is silence, be at peace, for in that moment, God may be teaching you the holiest lesson of faith, the sacred power hidden in stillness. Part 1. Sign 1-. When your words come from wounds, not wisdom. There are moments when words rise like storms within us, wild, trembling, unstoppable. They rush to escape before we even understand what we're saying. And yet, deep beneath the surface, those words are not born from wisdom or peace. They are born from pain. They come from the places inside us that still bleed, from disappointments never healed, from wounds that never quite closed. And it's there, right in that fragile space between the hurt and the impulse to speak, that God whispers, "Be still. Let me touch this pain before you let it speak for you." Because words born from wounds rarely heal. They cut, even when we don't mean for them to. They carry the bitterness of our scars, the sting of our fears, the echo of the moments when we were unseen or unloved. They do not flow with grace. They erupt with reaction. And when we release them too soon, we end up scattering fragments of our pain into the world, hoping someone will understand. But instead we only multiply the hurt. God knows this. That is why sometimes before we speak, He sends a holy hesitation, pause that feels uncomfortable, but sacred. You know that moment, your lips part, your heart pounds, and yet something holds you back. It is not weakness. It is the Spirit standing guard over your tongue. He is protecting you from saying something that will later grieve your soul. He is not silencing you to shame you. He is quieting you to heal you. For when pain is allowed to rule our words, our voice becomes a weapon. But when pain is surrendered to God, it becomes wisdom. There is a difference between speaking from a wound and speaking after it has been healed. One pierces, the other redeems. And the distance between the two is silence. That holy ground where God meets our raw humanity and teaches it how to breathe again. In that silence, the fire of anger cools into clarity. The sting of betrayal softens into understanding. The ache of rejection begins to sound like invitation. An invitation to bring our wounds not to the world but to the one who can hold them without judgment. And in that sacred exchange, God reshapes what was once bitter into something beautiful. Our silence becomes not suppression, but sanctuary. Think of how easily we lash out when hurt. The quick retorts, the defensive tones, the need to have the last word. Those moments feel powerful in the moment, but they always leave a shadow of regret, because deep down the heart knows when it has spoken too soon. But when you've waited, when you've prayed before you spoke, when you've let the Spirit wash through the wound, then your words no longer sting. They begin to carry peace instead of pain. God is not asking you to be voiceless. He is asking you to let Him refine your voice, to let Him filter every word through His Spirit before it leaves your lips. That is why sometimes He holds us in uncomfortable silence. He is softening the hardness that life has left in us. He is turning reaction into reflection, hurt into humility. He is training the heart to become slow to speak, quick to love. And when the time comes to speak again, you'll notice something. Your words no longer demand to be heard. They invite others to listen. They no longer carry the vibration of self-defense, but the tone of grace. They no longer echo the noise of pain, but the melody of peace. That's what happens when God has touched the wound before you speak. Your voice becomes an instrument of healing instead of harm. So when you feel that urge to speak in the heat of emotion, pause. Listen to the silence between your thoughts. Feel that gentle restraint of the Spirit. It's not the world silencing you. It's heaven protecting you. Let your silence become your prayer. Lord, calm my heart before I speak. Heal my wound before you give it words. And if you find yourself misunderstood or accused, and every part of you wants to explain, stay still a moment longer. For the God who sees every secret hurt also knows how to defend what you cannot. He will give your silence a voice louder than any argument. He will make your peace the testimony you thought you had to speak. In the end, it is not the loudest voices that change hearts. It is the voices that carry heaven's gentleness. And gentleness can only come from a heart that has learned to be still before God. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs the sound of healed souls. So, let your healing begin in the quiet. Let God speak to your wound before you speak to the world. Because when your words finally come, they will no longer come from pain. They will come from peace. They will not echo your brokenness. They will reveal His restoration. And through that sacred restraint, you will discover one of the greatest mysteries of faith, that sometimes the holiest thing you can say is nothing at all. And let your silence whisper the truth. God is still at work in me. Part 2. Sign 2. Pulse. When speaking would block what God is doing. There are moments when God is working quietly, steadily, invisibly, without the noise of human effort. He is rearranging broken pieces, softening hearts, opening doors we cannot yet see. And yet, in those very moments, Our human impulse is to speak, to explain, to intervene. We think we are helping God, but often, without realizing it, we are standing in the way of what He is doing. So in those heated, restless moments when our hearts burn to react, God whispers gently, "Be still, I am working." Sometimes He is preparing the ground for restoration, but our impatient words slow His process. Sometimes He is convicting someone's heart, but our harsh speech makes them shut down instead of open up. There are times when God tests our trust, when He asks, "Will you stay silent while I fight for you?" Because only in silence can faith be refined. If we still feel the need to control or to speak, our trust is not yet complete. Remember the Israelites standing before the Red Sea, army closing in behind, the waves roaring ahead. In their fear they cried out to Moses, and the Lord said, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. That was not just comfort. It was a command of faith. Silence in that moment was not weakness. It was trust. It was the kind of surrender that says, "I cannot, but He can." When we stay silent, we are telling heaven, "I believe you are doing what I cannot." And mysteriously, it is often in that stillness that God begins to move. When we stop trying to fix everything, He arranges things in ways far beyond our understanding. The one who hurt us begins to soften. The closed door suddenly swings open. Peace replaces panic. Silence becomes the soil where miracles grow, because it is in the quiet that human striving gives way to divine timing. True faith doesn't always shout or explain. Sometimes it simply rests. When you choose not to defend yourself, not to argue, not to prove, you are making the most powerful declaration a believer can make. My God is big enough to speak for me. The world may call it weakness, but heaven calls it surrendered strength, power hidden inside trust. Many times, God allows us to face moments where words no longer help, so we can learn that only obedient silence opens the way for miracles. Think of Jesus standing before His accusers. They mocked Him, lied about Him, and spat in His face. Yet He remained silent, not because He couldn't defend Himself, but because He refused to interrupt the Father's plan. One word from His mouth could have silenced the world, but He chose silence so that the cross could rise and redemption could be fulfilled. The silence of Jesus was not defeat. It was divine obedience. It showed us that some victories can only come through stillness. There are battles won not by argument, but by absolute trust. When you hold your tongue, you give God space to write the next line of your story. When you stop debating, He brings truth to light. When you choose not to speak just to be right, He makes things right in His time. Silence is not passivity. It is faith in motion. It takes courage to stay still when everything in you screams to react. It takes surrender to let go of control and allow God to steer. And when you finally do, you begin to see that miracles are not born from your words, but from your willingness to trust without speaking. So when you're misunderstood, mistreated, or when life feels unfair, don't rush to defend yourself. Pause, breathe, pray instead of reacting. Let God act, for He sees what you cannot see and knows what you cannot understand. And one day, you will look back and realize that your silence saved you from needless pain, from foolish mistakes, and opened a door only God could open. Silence before God is the ultimate test of faith. Those who pass it discover something sacred, that sometimes the strongest way to say, "I trust you, Lord," is not with words but with the holy stillness of a surrendered heart. Part 3. Sign 3. When God is teaching you to listen. There are moments when God is working quietly behind the scenes, in places your eyes cannot see, in hearts you cannot reach, in circumstances that feel still but are moving beneath the surface. Yet in those very moments our human instinct cries out to intervene, to explain, to take control, to fix what feels unfinished. We want to speak, to clarify, to make sense of what seems silent. But God in His mercy gently whispers, "Do not speak yet, I am still at work." It is one of the hardest lessons of faith, to believe that silence can do more than speech, that surrender can move mountains, more than striving ever could. For we are people who equate action with progress and words with power. Yet, in the kingdom of God, silence often carries a greater authority than the most eloquent argument. Sometimes, every word we feel desperate to say would only stand in the way of what God is orchestrating in the unseen. God's timing is delicate and divine. When He begins to weave His purposes, He does so with threads that extend far beyond our comprehension. And yet, like children watching a tapestry being woven from the back, we see only the tangled knots and frayed ends, so we rush to fix what is not finished. We speak too soon, defend too quickly, explain too much, trying to protect our reputation or rescue a situation that God Himself intends to redeem in His own way. But every time we speak out of fear instead of faith, we risk unraveling the threads He is patiently aligning. Think of the Israelites, standing before the Red Sea, terrified, trapped between water and sword. They wanted to shout, to panic, to demand answers, but through Moses, God said, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. That command was not passive. It was sacred strategy. God wasn't asking for silence to paralyze them. He was asking for silence to make space for His glory to move. When the people held their peace, the sea split open. Heaven does its greatest work when earth grows still. There are moments when our words, even well-intentioned ones, can block what God is doing. When we rush to explain ourselves, we may take away the chance for others to see God vindicate us. When we try to force understanding, we may disrupt the quiet conviction He is planting in another's heart. When we insist on controlling the narrative, we rob God of the opportunity to reveal His. And sometimes, the very battle we're trying to fight with our voices is the one He is asking us to surrender in silence. It is in this surrender that faith deepens. For faith is not proved in speaking. It is proved in trusting. The silence that once felt suffocating begins to feel like safety, because you realize you are no longer responsible for outcomes, only obedience. You begin to see that God doesn't need your words to defend your integrity, your worth, or your calling. He only needs your trust. And when you finally let go of the need to be heard, heaven begins to speak for you in ways you could never imagine. Look at Jesus standing before His accusers, the Son of God, full of truth, yet silent before lies. The crowd demanded answers. Pilate asked questions. The soldiers mocked Him, and still He said nothing. Not because He lacked defense, but because He understood divine timing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was obedience to a higher will. Every unspoken word became a testimony of surrender, and that surrender became salvation for the world. If He had spoken, the cross might never have been lifted. If He had defended Himself, redemption might never have been fulfilled. There will be times when God invites you into the same kind of holy restraint. He may ask you to hold your tongue when you long to explain, to stay still when you want to fight, to wait when everything in you wants to move. Not because your voice doesn't matter, but because your silence is part of His strategy. He is protecting you from saying something that will limit what He is building. He is shaping your character in the waiting, refining your faith in the quiet, preparing your victory in the stillness. You see, when you stop trying to make things happen, you leave room for miracles to unfold. When you stop defending yourself, you allow God to show Himself as your defender. When you stop arguing, the truth has a chance to rise unopposed. And when you stop filling every silence with words, you begin to hear the deeper rhythm of heaven, the still, steady heartbeat of a God who is never rushed, never late, and never wrong. There is a peace that comes when you finally release the need to speak. It's the peace of knowing that the one who spoke the universe into existence can also speak on your behalf. He doesn't need your help to make His plans succeed. He only asks for your quiet trust while He works them out. So when you find yourself tempted to fill the silence, remember, God is not asking you to do nothing. He is asking you to let Him do everything. And one day, when the season of silence ends, you will see what He was doing all along. The doors that once seemed closed will open effortlessly. The The truth that once felt buried will rise on its own. The people who once doubted you will see God's hand without you ever saying a word. And you will realize that every unspoken thought, every withheld defense, every tear you poured out in quiet trust was not wasted. It was worship. Because, in the end, silence is not the absence of faith. It is its purest form. It is the place where surrender becomes strength, where stillness becomes testimony, and where your trust speaks louder than any words ever could. When you can stand in peace and say nothing, and still believe God is working, that is when your silence becomes the most powerful sermon your life will ever preach. Part 4. Sign 4. Then your words could harm God's work in you. There are times when God is working within you so delicately, so deeply, that even a single word could disturb what He is forming. His work is quiet, like a seed taking root beneath the soil. Invisible, yet alive with purpose. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It simply grows in hidden places where no one is watching. But our human nature struggles with the unseen. We want to share what God is doing before it's ready. We want to speak of the dream before it's mature, to prove we are chosen before we are changed. Yet God, in His wisdom, whispers, "Be still. What I am growing in you must be protected by silence." There is something sacred about the work God does in secret. He hides His handiwork within your spirit, guarding it from voices that could crush it, from doubt that could poison it, from pride that could expose it too soon. For every divine purpose requires incubation, a period of concealment, where faith must hold what the flesh cannot yet explain. Just as a mother carries her child unseen before the world can celebrate the birth, so the Spirit of God conceives dreams, callings, and transformations within the womb of your soul. And in that season, silence is not punishment. It is protection. We often mistake exposure for growth. But God knows that the most powerful things He creates, faith, character, purpose, are the ones that must first grow in darkness. The seed cannot survive if it's dug up too soon. The song cannot bless if it's sung before it's finished. The promise cannot stand if it's spoken before it's sealed. And so there are times when God restrains you, not because you have nothing to say, but because your words would weaken what He is strengthening within you. He knows how fragile the early stages of your faith can be, how easily the opinions of others can sway your confidence, how quickly praise can inflate pride, and how swiftly criticism can wound belief. So He hides you. He places His hand over your mouth, not to silence your calling, but to shield your becoming. It is a holy silence, the kind that forms roots before it reveals fruit. Think of Mary, who, after hearing the angel's promise that she would carry the Son of God, did not run through the streets declaring her destiny. Scripture says she kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. She understood that some miracles can only survive when cradled in quiet faith. To speak too soon would invite disbelief. To share too quickly would cheapen what was sacred. Her silence was her sanctuary, the place where the divine was nurtured until the appointed time. So it is with you. God may be building something extraordinary inside your life, a calling, a transformation, a healing, a purpose, but He may not want you to speak of it yet. He may be whispering, "Let me finish before you tell the world," because every word spoken prematurely can draw attention to what should still be hidden. Every explanation offered too early can invite misunderstanding that strangles faith. Every attempt to justify yourself can turn your trust inward when it should remain upward. There is a kind of humility that only silence can teach. The humility that says, God's work in me is not for display, it's for His glory. When you learn to stay silent in seasons of unseen growth, you are learning to trust that what He started, He will complete, without your voice needing to validate it. You are letting God be the author of your story instead of trying to write the ending yourself. But silence is not easy. It tests your patience, your pride, your willingness to be misunderstood. People may question you, doubt you, misread your quietness as weakness. Yet even then, God calls you to remain still, for He is teaching you to find validation, not in recognition, but in relationship. The approval of heaven is quieter, but infinitely more satisfying than the applause of the world. And one day, when his work is ready, when the roots have gone deep and the branches are strong enough to hold the fruit, God himself will bring it to light. You won't need to announce what he's done. The evidence will speak for itself. Like Zechariah, whose tongue was loosed only when the promise of John the Baptist was fulfilled, your voice will return. But this time, it will carry revelation instead of restlessness, testimony instead of explanation. What once was hidden will bloom with beauty, and every day of silence will prove to have been a season of preparation. Because silence doesn't bury what God is doing. It blesses it. It is the soil of faith, the shelter of formation, the breath between promise and fulfillment. It is in that hush that your heart learns the sacred rhythm of waiting, trusting, becoming, and when you finally emerge, you will no longer need to speak from striving. Your very life will tell the story. So, if God has called you into a quiet season, if he has asked you to hold your tongue, to hide your progress, to keep the holy thing he's birthing in you close to your heart, do not resist. Do not mistake the stillness for stagnation. Something divine is unfolding beneath the surface. Something that will one day shine with his glory. For the silence that feels so heavy now is the sound of heaven working in secret. And when the time comes, when the work is complete and your heart has been refined, you will understand why God asked you to stay silent. You will see that every unspoken word was a shield. Every hidden moment was a sanctuary. Every delay was divine. You will realize that your silence did not hinder his work. It protected it, preserved it, perfected it. Because sometimes the greatest act of faith is not to speak, but to let God finish what he began. And when the world finally sees the beauty that has been growing in the dark, they will know it was not your words that made it possible. It was his hands, quietly crafting his masterpiece within the silence of your soul. Part 5. Sign 5. When silence becomes your witness of faith, there comes a moment in every believer's journey when God no longer asks for explanations, defenses, or even words. He asks for silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of faith. It is the kind of stillness that speaks louder than any argument. The kind that carries the weight of surrender and the fragrance of trust. In that sacred hush, your silence becomes a testimony more powerful than speech, a witness that declares to heaven and earth alike, I believe God, even here, even now, even when I don't understand. Faith is not always proven in what we say. Sometimes it is revealed most deeply in what we choose not to say. When you are misunderstood, but stay calm. When you are hurt, but do not retaliate. When you could explain yourself, but instead choose to rest in God's knowing. That is when your silence becomes your sermon. For in that stillness, you are proclaiming something that words never could, that your confidence no longer rests in being right, but in being his. There is a sacred beauty in this kind of restraint, a quiet dignity that the world cannot comprehend. Because silence born of faith is not emptiness. It is authority under control. It is the strength of a heart that has learned to trust God's defense more than its own. It is the wisdom of a soul that knows when speaking would only diminish the holy work of peace being formed within. And though the world may mistake your calm for weakness, heaven calls it worship. Jesus embodied this holy silence when he stood before his accusers. The crowds mocked, the leaders lied, and yet he said nothing. The one who could command angels with a word chose instead to stand in stillness. He didn't need to prove his innocence. The cross would do that in time. His silence was not surrender to his enemies. It was surrender to his Father's will, and in that silence, the greatest victory in history was won. It was there in the hush between accusation and crucifixion that redemption was conceived. So it is with you. When you hold your peace instead of proving your point, when you let God defend your name instead of fighting for it yourself, you are walking in the footsteps of your Savior. Each moment of silence becomes a declaration of your faith, a faith that says, I don't need to win this battle because God already has. And when you choose that path, something shifts in the unseen. the noise of the world grows dim, and the presence of God becomes louder in your spirit. You begin to realize that the calm you carry is not your own. It is His. But make no mistake, this silence is not easy. It takes far more courage to hold your tongue than to use it. It takes deep trust to resist the urge to justify yourself. It takes maturity to remain gentle when you could be harsh, to stay still when every impulse says to speak. Yet every time you do, heaven bears witness. Every time you choose peace over pride, grace over control, and quiet faith over loud reaction, you are building an altar of worship in the middle of your battle, and God delights in that altar. For your silence is not passive, it is prophetic. It tells the enemy, you will not pull me into your chaos. It tells the world, my peace doesn't depend on circumstance. It tells heaven, I trust you completely. That is the language of faith, not spoken in eloquent prayers or powerful sermons, but in the gentle, unwavering stillness of a soul anchored in God's presence. And one day, those who doubted you will see what God was doing in your quiet. They will realize that your silence was not emptiness, but expectancy, that while you seemed to say nothing, God was saying everything through you. For the Spirit speaks loudest through those who have learned to be still. The same peace that sustained you will begin to speak for you. The same calm that once felt costly will become the very evidence of God's hand upon your life. When silence becomes your witness, you no longer fear misunderstanding, because you have discovered that being known by God is enough. You no longer chase validation, because His approval has quieted the noise of your need. You no longer seek to defend your story, because you trust the author who is still writing it. And so your silence is no longer something you endure. It becomes something you offer, a holy act of worship, an unspoken prayer of surrender. Perhaps that is why faith so often ends where words do. Because when faith matures, it no longer needs to shout to be real. It simply rests. It looks at the storm and says nothing, not out of fear, but out of certainty, because it knows the one who commands the wind and the waves. That kind of faith is not loud. It is not flashy. It is quiet, steady, and immovable. It carries the stillness of heaven itself. So if you find yourself in a season where God calls you to silence, do not mistake it for isolation. It is not the end of your witness. It is the beginning of a deeper one. For your silence is not absence. It is presence. It is God's voice speaking through your peace. God's strength holding you when you could have fallen apart. God's grace turning your restraint into testimony. And when all is said and done, the world will remember not the noise that surrounded you, but the peace that marked you. They will see a quiet strength that could not have come from you. And in that moment, your silence will have preached the loudest sermon of all. That faith is not proven by how much you speak for God, but by how deeply you trust Him when He speaks through your stillness. For in the end, silence is not the absence of faith. It is the echo of heaven, in the soul of one who has learned to rest in the heart of God. Part 6. Conclusion. The sacred power hidden in silence. There are journeys that do not end with words, but with a sacred stillness. The moment the soul stands before God and realizes that sometimes what He desires most is not for us to understand everything, but simply to rest in Him. After all the seasons of misunderstanding, pain and waiting, after being led into the quiet places of the heart, we come to see that it was there, in the silence, that God was teaching us how to hear, how to trust, and how to grow. Silence, which once felt like emptiness, reveals itself to be the space where grace overflows. We used to think God was found only in the singing, in the miracles, in the prayers He answered. But then we discovered He also lives in the pauses between our breaths, in the steady heartbeat that continues even as everything around us falls apart. It's in that quiet space that He walks in, not with noise or urgency, but with a presence so gentle it melts the soul. And we finally understand He was never far. We were just too busy speaking to listen, too eager explaining to truly feel. This journey, from wounds to stillness, from fear to surrender, is not an easy one, but it is the path of those whom God chooses to walk slowly with him. He doesn't just want us to speak about him. He wants us to live in him, and to live in him fully. He sometimes must teach us to be silent, so that every voice of the flesh fades, and only the whisper of the Spirit remains. When we are silent because of pain, he heals. When we are silent because of trust, he moves. When we are silent out of reverence, he is exalted. And when we are silent simply because words are no longer needed, because we know he understands, he smiles. For that is the moment when our soul and his heart beat as one. Perhaps you are in a season where everything feels silent. No answers, no signs, only stillness. But do not fear. It is not God's absence. It is the sacred space where he is renewing your soul. In that quiet, he is rewriting your story with the ink of trust. Every tear you've shed becomes a stroke of his pen. And when the work is complete, you'll look back and see that every moment of silence that once frightened you was actually a note in the symphony of faith. So do not despise the silence. Let it become your sanctuary, the holy place where you meet God. Let it be the soil where faith takes root, where grace blooms. Let it be not the mark of emptiness, but the sign of depth. For the soul that knows how to be silent before God is the soul that will one day speak with his breath. And when this journey finally comes to its close, you will see every sign, every warning, every whisper from God led to one truth, that silence is the doorway to his presence. It does not steal your voice, it purifies it. It does not weaken your faith. It refines it until it shines like crystal. In that stillness, you don't just find God, you find your true self, reborn in grace, anchored in peace, wrapped in unshakable love. One day, you will stand in the middle of life and simply smile, not needing to speak, not needing to prove, not needing to win. You will just breathe and know that God is still there, as he always has been, in every silent chapter of your life. And in that holy realization, you'll understand every moment he told you not to speak, every time he led you into silence, was never to take away your voice, but to teach you how to speak through stillness and live through faith. For in the end, silence is the language of souls that have touched heaven.